So this is a fun talk for me to give. Many of you know me as Renee, the person who likes to take care of people with LGS. And that's true, but I wear an awful lot of hats. What you might not know is my largest NIH grant is actually looking at sleep as a potential intervention for an at-risk population. So I'm getting to bring some of the Venn diagram of the hats that I wear together today, and that's really exciting for me. So here are my disclosures. Funding from NIH. I write neonatal seizure chapters for UpToDate, work with the study consortium, and am honored to be able to serve as president-elect of the Pediatric Epilepsy Research Foundation. My objective really for this whole session is to convince you that sleep research is exciting and it's the way forward for us. So we're gonna go through just 4 lessons that I have started to learn along my journey as an imposter in the sleep world. Here's the first lesson. Sleep research requires radical collaboration. We think in the epilepsy world that we understand multidisciplinary work. We've got nothing to the sleep people. In the teams that I work with, we have sleep physicians. I'm not sleep trained. We have neurologists, we have pulmonologists, we have psychologists, psychiatrists, developmental and behavioral pediatrics, a whole lot of different surgery specialties, pharmacology and pharmacists, statisticians, engineering, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. These are big teams, and what's really cool is they come at the problem from different angles, and sometimes they ask a question that just blows your mind and blows open a whole new line of research. So we can learn from this, okay? This is, so I moved from the University of Michigan about a year ago to WashU in St. Louis. I still am very privileged to be able to work with this team that we put together at U of M, who are focused on neonatal sleep research. So we have pulmonology, neonatology, adult sleep, maternal fetal medicine, neurosurgery, neuropsychology, neuroradiology, fantastic project manager, a whole bunch of sleep techs, statisticians, and so on. And we built this team over time and really have, it's been really a privilege to be able to develop this out. And what we started to say was, okay, well, what are the opportunities here in sleep research for babies? And we developed a study looking at sleep as a potentially modifiable risk factor for abnormal cognition in at-risk babies. And we looked around and we said, gosh, you know what? We have a lot of babies in our NICU who have myelomeningocele. And turns out, really cool data to say a fetal surgery can help them with the chance of walking and reduce the chance of needing a VP shunt. The problem is it doesn't change their cognitive outcomes. But the cognitive profile looks a lot like people who have untreated sleep disordered breathing. So we started to look at that and said, well, gosh, you know, sleep disordered breathing is treatable. What if they have it not just when they're older kids and adults, but what if they have it as newborns, did that initial pilot and said, oh golly, we're onto something. And now we're building and have built this network through the North American Fetal Therapy Network of 9 centers across the country who now all have a team that looks like the big team I just showed you at the University of Michigan. What we learned here is about the challenges of bringing this kind of new team together in the setting of a pandemic because, of course, we were funded at the beginning of 2020. So the lesson here, deliberate onboarding is absolutely essential for this kind of work. These are big teams of people who are not used to working together. They have different language. They're physically located in different places. Thankfully, we can use Zoom to help that. They have different priorities, right? If you ask the neonatologist about what's urgent, and you ask the pediatric pulmonologist about what's urgent, and the neurologist, like they're not always the same. What's an emergency in those different scenarios? Not always the same. And so there's a lot of work to be done to just bring those teams together and to teach our site PIs, most of whom are not sleep doctors, about what language to use, the leadership skills that they need, and so on, in order to make this happen, right? Because we're a big team of big teams. It works, but it takes deliberate effort. So that's the first thing, is that radical collaboration. The second thing is recording sleep in a baby. That's complicated. There are a lot of ways, just like Geeta just showed us, to be able to record sleep. For us, we said, okay, well, we need a gold standard to start because we're starting a brand new field here. We were looking at full polysonogram on a newborn infant. This is not an actual newborn infant, that's a baby doll. But baby doll got dressed up in all of this stuff so that we could show it to parents and say, we know it's a lot, but this is a way to do it. And so we get EEG, and we get respiratory channels and heart rate and pulse ox and so on and so forth. And we can do it, but we have to be able to learn how to communicate it. We have to make sure that our sleep techs understand and all the nurses and everybody else in the NICU, right? It's complicated, but it's doable. Polysomnography has a lot of moving parts, right? So not just the EEG, but lots of other sensors. They're there for lots of data. The data sharing, right? We've sort of learned in the neurology world how to share EEGs. Data sharing in PSG, polysomnograms, is a little trickier as it turns out. How long we record the study is something that we had to spend a lot of time thinking about, right? How long will a baby or a person with LGS tolerate having a polysomnogram going? How long can we afford to have a sleep tech at the bedside? When we do this in the NICU setting, we have somebody whose only job that night is to sit at that one baby's bedside to make sure that this study goes well. So workforce management is an issue, and the way that we analyze the data is also an issue to be addressed. Local site interpretation of these studies has been really important and important as part of the ethics of our study. So when we first started doing pilot studies in the NICU of babies, we found, oh my gosh, there were babies who looked on their regular monitors like their breathing was okay, but when we did a formal polysomnogram, which is much more sensitive, we were finding a lot of abnormalities, and so we had to find a way in our protocols to read those out quickly so that the abnormalities could be addressed by the clinical team. That's going to be something I suspect that as we study sleep in people with LGS, we're going to have to address. And then we have that local site interpretation, but central scoring for the science and for making sure that we're consistent in how, what are we calling abnormal and normal is also really important. So lots of different things to think about when you're designing a study around sleep. Some more decisions. How many EEG channels do you need? Where will you do the study? Are you going to bring somebody into an outpatient sleep lab? Is that the safe place? Do they need to be in the hospital because we're worried they might have seizures? Do you need a tech at the bedside one-on-one, or can you do this in a one-on-many kind of setting? What duration of recording is tolerable? How much sleep do you need to record, right? Just because you have the whole setup on doesn't mean that the person is sleeping, right? So how much sleep is acceptable to analyze those data? All the standardized collection protocols and montage, and again, these are people who haven't necessarily worked together before, so making sure that's clear and readdressing it over and over because there's drift once you've gotten people on board. Having techs trained and tested. One of the really cool things they do in the sleep world is that they have tech training and tests that they have to pass in order to do this so that a sleep study that is done, on one side of the country gets interpreted basically the same way as one on the other side. We just assume as epilepsy doctors that we know what we're doing when we read an EEG, right? It's a little different in the sleep world. And then safety. What do we do about unexpectedly abnormal findings is really key. Having protocols in place for urgent, right now, interventions. When is it required? When are you as a study design person going to require that the people at the bedside studying a baby or a child will apply oxygen saturation, call their on-call emergency doc, think about adding CPAP. And again, that local center review and reporting to the clinical team. In this case, as we think about LGS, we also need to think about seizure action plans and how would you do that in the setting of a sleep lab. Lesson 3, invest in your relationship with IT and sleep lab staff. This is going to be really, really, really important. When we started our study, it seemed so easy, right? You record the polysomnogram, you hit the button that converts it to an EDF format, you upload it to my server, I pull it down, my tech can score it, and we're all good. And that works for half of our sites, no problem. But as you all know, whatever can go wrong will go wrong. Sometimes the signals just don't come through on the EDF. I don't know. Different software at different sites can cause different problems. Even if it's the same company, they might have a different version. And so, if this site's working well and this one uses the same company, just having them talk to each other doesn't necessarily solve the problem. Our tech staff are in really short supply, so here's one of the things that happened in the pandemic was that sleep labs were considered not essential, and so a lot of sleep techs got furloughed, but they have skills that we can use in the neurology and epilepsy world, and a lot of them became became EEG techs. And guess what? They kind of like working during the day instead of at night, and so we've poached some of the talent, and so actually just having the people available to do PSGs across different centers is actually a big deal. And some people are scared of babies. Shockingly, some people are also scared of people who have seizures. So we're gonna have to work on the education piece in a big way. So making friends with the people who understand how the software works, really, really key. Making friends with the people who work after hours in the sleep lab, absolutely key. So being there at 8 o'clock at night to talk to the sleep tech team, for example, you have to do. And also just word to the wise, figuring out, is it flowers, is it caffeine, is it chocolate? What is it that makes people happy? That's really, really important when you're leading a team like this. So I can tell you, my program manager, it's chocolate. So I send chocolate, and that's fine. But you gotta know that. All right, lesson 4, central review can be complicated. So first thing is, which data matter to you? There's a lot of different ways that we can measure sleep. We can look at macro architecture, how long are people asleep, in what sleep stages, what are their arousals look like. We can look at micro architecture, what are the characteristics of sleep spindles, things like that. Respiratory parameters, we can look at sleep disordered breathing, the apnea-hypopnea index, oxygen desaturations. Cardiac parameters, heart rate variability, cardiopulmonary coupling. We can look at periodic limb movements. We can look at the overall interpretation. Is this normal, abnormal? If abnormal, kind of which clinical bucket would you put it in? There are a lot of different ways that you could interpret. So what we have done for our studies, we have a central sleep tech who's blinded to study group, who scores all of our polysomnograms. We have 2 independent blinded reviewers. One of them is a pulmonologist and one is a neurologist. They have different angles in how they review things. We also get clinical reports from the sites, and I'll tell you that in a minute. So we started with these 2 sleep docs to interpret the study. We compared their case reports forms, and then they did a consensus review for things that they didn't agree on. Over some calibration time, we've had a need for fewer and fewer consensus reviews, and actually their kappa statistics are quite good. And so now with 3 years under our belt, many of our studies really only need to be reviewed by one of our reviewers, which is helping efficiency. When we compare to our site clinical records, and I think this is partly because of the central training from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine for our techs, the apnea-hypopnea index and the quantitative variables actually are pretty close to what our central scores look like for the most part. But we have differences in the overall interpretation buckets, which is really fascinating to me, where our sites are calling much more obstructive sleep apnea than our central reviewers. And my guess is most of these sites didn't do neonatal polysomnography before I came into their lives, and they were much more used to looking at older children and adult sleep studies where the focus usually is around obstructive sleep apnea, so I think they're calling it more often. So it's just a matter of calibration and understanding. It's not just me who does this kind of very intense study design. This is a standard that's come across from many other trials. For example, the PATS study looking at adenotonsillectomy for snoring, the childhood adenotonsillectomy trial. There are several big, well-regarded studies that have used a similar pattern. this study, or paper with the first author of Mazzotti, I would refer you to as something to take a look at if you want to think about how you design. And what they did was, with the Sleep Research Network, put together the concepts of what needs to happen in order to really do great multicenter sleep research. And those are underpinning concepts for the National Sleep Research Resource, which has like thousands and thousands and thousands of polysomnograms stored in a way that we could access. As best I can tell, they don't have thousands of repositoried PSGs for people with epilepsy, but that doesn't mean we couldn't learn from them to really collaborate and bring things together. So I hope that I have convinced you that sleep research is really, really exciting. This is a way forward. It is complicated, but we can do it, okay? It's radically multidisciplinary. Again, complicated. We need to invest in relationships, and central review can be complicated, but we can do this. All right? And we should, and I'm really excited about it because if we think about sleep, it'll force us to think and collaborate differently. We will be able to ask new and different questions that could have a different angle of impact on our kids and our families, okay? That's what we're all about, right? We need to blow this open. It's not just one more incremental change. This is a way that we could really take big steps forward for the field. So that's my hope for us, and that's why I'm so glad that you're all here and thinking about sleep.